The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay, so let's get started. So before I get into any poker, I want to talk about the mentality I want everyone to try to have when analyzing poker in this class. So I call it the decision mentality. So I'm going to start with a story. Who here has heard of credit card roulette? It's like a game you play at the end of going to restaurants. So what happens is poker players, they're going to split the bill by, instead of everyone paying your own bill, which is annoying, right? You have to like keep track. You might have to Venmo people after the exact amount. And sometimes the waiter or waitress doesn't want to split the bill per person. So poker players get around this by just picking one person at random to pay the bill. And we like making this exciting. So what we do is we ask everyone to put in your credit card, and then we pull out the credit cards one at a time. And if your credit card is pulled out, then you're safe. And the last person in has to pay for the whole table. So it's a pretty fun game. I think I'm pretty lucky at it. The biggest one I've lost was in Hong Kong. I once had to pay around 1,200 USD. It was a pretty big table. But overall, I'm pretty good at this game. It's a game of skill for sure. So, all right. But sometimes this results in some funny stories with non-poker players. So this is something that happened to some poker players. So Poker Pro Matt, he goes to dinner with Poker Pro Steven, and then Matt brings Emily, who's a close friend who he also has romantic interest in. So when the bill comes, Matt's like, okay, I'm going to pay for Emily. So he puts in 2 credit cards. He's like, the second credit card is for Steven, is for Emily. And then Steven pays for himself, so Steven puts in 1 credit card. So they play credit card roulette. And then Matt, being a very lucky guy, pulls out both of his credit cards before Steven's, and Steven ends up paying for all 3 of them. Okay, so now the question is, who should Emily thank? So who would you thank if you were in Emily's shoes? Matt. Does anyone want to say thanks, Steven?
Yeah.
Okay, because Steven actually paid for the meal, right? So I think it's a totally reasonable thing to do as a reasonable person to thank Steven, to actually have to follow his wallet. So in this class, we want everyone to think in terms of expected results and not actual results. So Emily should be thanking Matt, because on average, Matt put in the card for Emily, and on average, Matt is going to be paying for Emily, because Matt's going to be paying the 1/3 of the time that Emily would be paying. But at the time, Emily thanked Steven for her meal and then didn't say anything to Matt. And then Matt was upset about it and told the entire poker community. And that's all I found out about this story. Okay, so we want to think about in terms of, on average, what your decision would have made, whether you would have made money in expectation or on average. So roughly, the law of large numbers says over your lifetime, the amount you end up paying from credit card roulette is the same as you would have paid from splitting the bill. So, why split the bill? You might as well just save a lot of time by playing this fun game every single time. And over your lifetime, the amount you pay in credit card roulette is roughly going to be what you would have paid from splitting. And so all randomness eventually averages out to its expected value. That's what this is saying. So what does eventually mean? So basically, when we say a gamble is very risky, I'm not mathematically defining anything here, but I just want to throw out some intuitive concepts. So a risky gamble is a gamble where it takes a long time to converge at your expectation. But the point is, no matter how risky it is, eventually it'll get you. So poker players, so there's a saying that like, death, taxes are the 2 things that eventually get you. As poker players, we like to think that 3 things eventually get you. It's death, taxes, and the law of large numbers. Well, eventually, you're going to reach your long run. Okay, so here's another hypothetical situation. So let's say you get off at the wrong bus stop because you were distracted. And then you're upset yourself. You analyze how to not get distracted in the future and get off at the right bus stop. But then after you get off at the wrong bus stop, you find $1,000 on the ground. And then you're no longer upset and you marvel at your riches. So this is sort of an absurd story, but situations like this happen all the time in poker. You're going to make a bad decision, but bad decisions still get a good result 49% of the time. And if you make the right decision, you're still going to get a bad result 49% of the time. So it's very important to analyze your decisions without being biased by the actual outcome that occurred. So you really want to be obsessed with this like self-improvement, analyzing your decisions. If you've made like $10,000 in a situation where you could have made $12,000, then that's not good enough. So I want everyone to think in terms of, what's the maximum you could have made and analyzing what's the best decision you could have possibly made in every situation. And sometimes it's hard, right? Because if the result is exactly correlated with the decision, then you can just go back and look at the result and know whether you made a good decision or not. But that's why learning poker can sometimes be very, very hard. Because you don't have immediate feedback. You're not sure whether the decision you made is what caused you to make that money, or you just got lucky. Okay, so with that being said, so now let's talk about some ways to reason about poker hands. So roughly there's 3 levels of reasoning in poker hands. So level 1 is my hand versus your hand. So but by this I mean you can see what your cards are. And you look into your opponent's eyes and you say, okay, I can tell your cards must be pocket kings or whatever. Your hand must be this other hand. And you play your hand exactly against your opponent's specific hand because you have a soul read on them. So, all right, so let's see an example of this. So we'll watch an episode of Poker After Dark here.
Raise to 1200.
No longer I afraid of it.
I think you would call it this time, Patrick.
Sure. Button raise is never anything.
Contrary to what Patrick might think, Jennifer has a real hand, and it just got better. She's flopped top set. Patrick flopped a pair of 10s with a gut shot straight draw.
Bet 2,000.
Full house? I can't beat that.
I thought you had pocket kings. I was like,
I almost thought I had to.
what did you have?
Okay, so this is a sort of well-known poker fan from way back in the day. If you're a Jennifer Tillingham, I'm sorry for making fun of her. But basically, right, so she put her opponent on a specific hand. She looked at Patrick Antonius and had a feeling that he had pocket kings for some strange reason. And then what happened was, so she has pocket jacks here, which is a really, really good hand. It's a full house. And she just checked the turn and checked the river instead of trying to get Patrick to put more money in because she was so certain Patrick had pocket kings. And, just mathematically speaking, out of all the possible combinations of cards you could have, to put your opponent specifically on pocket kings in this example is basically unfounded. So this gets to level 2 reasoning. So level 2 reasoning is my hand versus your range of hands, versus your probability distribution of hands. And another name for this is exploitative play. So let's look at a different hand, and I'm going to show you how to reason about this hand using level 2 exploitative reasoning. So, okay. So I'm not going to go through the whole hand, but this is actually a real hand I played in Macau about 5-6 years ago. So we get to the river, and I have ace 10 in this situation. So the pot is 21,000 roughly, and my opponent bets 8,000. Sorry, so the pot is 21,000 after my opponent bets 8,000. So basically, the pot was 13,000, and my opponent bet 8,000, making it 21,000. And I have to decide whether to call with a pretty good hand. I have a pair of aces here. but I know my opponent is Rain Khan, who's a very tight player and doesn't really like bluffing. So I don't think he's really ever bluffing. If I'm beating him here, it's because he's betting a hand that he thinks is good, but is actually worse than mine, like ace-8, basically. So I model my opponent's range as ace-king through ace-8. I don't think he has something even stronger, like pocket nines, because he would have raised more earlier in the hand. But basically, okay, so let me run through this calculation sort of slowly for those of you seeing pot odds for the first time. So here, basically, I want to think of it like this. The pot, which includes the 8,000 he just put out, is 21,000. We're considering calling for 8,000, so if we lose, if we call and he turns up ace-king, which is a better hand, then our net result from this decision is negative $8,000. If we win, we get our 8,000 back, as well as the 21,000 in the pot, so we make, our net is plus 21,000. So therefore, our win-to-lose ratio needs to be at least 8,000 to 21,000 in order for calling to be positive expectancy. So, all right, so we'll do the exact calculation. I'll try to do it somewhat slowly to show an example of how to do this calculation. So essentially what I do is I count the combinations of, I count the combinations of each hand that exist. So ace-king, there's 8 combinations because there's 2 aces remaining that I haven't seen, and there's 4 kings remaining. So it's 2 times 4, there's 8 combinations. Same with ace-queen, ace-jack, and ace-8. Ace-10 and ace-9, there's only 6 combinations each because I have a 10, which makes him having ace-10 less likely. And for ace-9, there's a 9 on the board. So ace-9 is also slightly less likely. So ace-10, we actually get half the pot. So I'm just going to roughly, I'm going to make that equivalent to us winning 3 of those times and us losing 3 of those times, which is equivalent in expectation. So basically, if you do this counting, there's 33 combinations that beat us. There's 11 combinations that we beat. And so our equity is basically our probability of winning, which is equivalently the fraction of the pot that we own. So our equity in this case is 25%. And the pot odds are 21 to 8. And then so we need basically 1 over 3.56. So 21 to 8 is 2.56 to 1. We need equity 1 over 3.56 to call, which is 28%, which we don't have, so I folded. Sorry. So unfortunately, this calculation is a bit ugly. You just have to do it a bunch of times and convince yourself that you're doing the right calculation. Basically, you got to remember to add 1 when you're converting the odds ratio to an equity. But it's but yeah, so it should be fairly simple math. But so in this case, I folded because I didn't have the desired equity. So is there any questions about that? That was maybe a bit confusing, but I don't know of a great way to sort of show the exact conversion from pot odds into equity. But I just want to point out that they're slightly different. Just one is a ratio of win to lose, and one is basically a fraction of win over all possible outcomes. So just don't get confused by this. That's all I'm saying. I'm going to sort of quickly interchange between the two throughout the course, and you should try to get in the habit of being able to quickly compute between the two. Okay, so this is an example of level 2 reasoning, and hand reading is about using your opponent's past actions and your knowledge of their tendencies to tweak your probability distribution over what you think their hand is. So hand reading is not about pegging your opponent on a specific hand. So, it's sort of a marketing message. Poker players, they wear sunglasses, they have earplugs to prevent people from reading their soul. I mean, it matters a bit, but really these things, things like I scratched my ear before I raised, it should affect your belief about my cards a very small amount, way less than what Lady Gaga and the media makes it seem like. Okay. So that's sort of how you reason about a hand exploitatively. You build a model for how your opponent behaves, and you make the decision that's the most positive expectancy against that model. And you can go very, very far with level 2 reasoning. You can basically build a career out of level 2 reasoning. And it's best targeted towards individual opponents with specific tendencies that you're trying to take advantage of. So, okay, so this sounds very good, right? This sounds like a great way to play poker. I figure out what my opponent's doing, right? I figure out the probability distribution and play in a way to make the most money from him. So, does anyone have any problems with this type of reasoning? So, okay, so I've got some $20 Amazon gift certificates from Acuna Capital. If someone can point out potentially something you don't like about this type of reasoning, I'll give you this gift certificate. Yeah. That's
You reveal a lot of information about what your hand is when you think like this.
Right, but what if your model incorporates the fact that they're going to behave based on what they think is in your hand? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it might take you a long time to build this model, and if players leave your table or whatever, like, you spend, like, because before you have the model, you can't use this line of reasoning.
Right.
So it's expensive to, like, do it.
Right, yeah, that's a good point, yeah. So first of all, yeah, so first of all, level 2 reasoning is not easy. Even though it has flaws, even playing very good level 2 poker is not easy. Building the model can be very hard, and you could be wrong, yeah. But that's not really what I'm looking for. Yeah, Colin, yeah.
Because if your opponent knows your reasoning, then he could maybe bet a certain way to push it to 28%, where you would only call if it's
right. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think that'll be good enough. Okay, I'm gonna give this to you. I'll give it to you at the end. Okay. Right. So essentially, yeah. The problem is it's this assumption. The fatal flaw in every plan is the assumption that you know more than your enemy. Does anyone know where this is from, by the way? If you do, I'll have another $20 gift certificate. Does anyone know where this phrase is from? Yeah, right.
From Clausewitz?
No. Yeah, okay.
The Arts of War?
No. Okay, it's okay. If no one knows, I'm going to keep the gift certificate. Okay, no, it's okay. All right, so essentially, the problem with this line of reasoning is your opponent does not play according to a fixed static algorithm. They're also an intelligent human who's taking this class, who's building models for you and adapting the strategy to beat you, right? So if you assume your opponent plays with a fixed strategy, but what if they're doing the same for you? So now I'm going to get to the third level of reasoning, which I call optimal play. So let's analyze the exact same hand using level 3 reasoning. So don't get me wrong, level 2 reasoning is great. If you can do level 2 reasoning very well, you can make a ton of money. But level 3 reasoning is a completely different way to analyze this hand that can also make you a lot of money. So level 3 reasoning, I'm going to think like this. Instead of thinking, so level 3 is my range of hands over your range of hands. So instead of looking at my specific cards and figuring out what my cards are, I'm actually going to also put a probability distribution over myself and ask myself, to my opponent's eyes, what is the probability distribution of my hands? And in this specific spot, let's just say I decide that my range in this spot is ace-jack through ace-7. So not including ace-9. It's basically ace-jack, ace-10, ace-8, ace-7. So this is the way I do the calculation. So let's just assume I know my opponent's propensity is to bet 1 over 1.6% of the pot on the river. So roughly in this spot, so the pot was 13,000 on the river, and I know that my opponent's going to bet 8,000. So I must call with the frequency such that their EV from bluffing is 0. So that's essentially my goal with optimal play. So essentially what I'm saying is, let's say they have a really bad hand. They have like Jack 10 for Jack high, which is almost certainly going to lose the pot if they don't bet to try to get me to fold. Then I want to call with the frequency such that with those hands, regardless of whether they bluff, their expectation is 0. So how do I do that? I just make my call to fold ratio 1.6 to 1. In all these computations, to make it easier, I'm assuming I'm rough. 1.6 is like approximate for the ratio. It's actually 13 over 8, but I chose, it actually turned out to be mostly Fibonacci numbers, so the ratio is around 1.6 to 1 for all of them. So I'm making that shortcut. Okay, so my call to fold ratio needs to be 1.6 to 1, so that if they have a bad hand, their expectation from bluffing is 0. It doesn't matter whether they bluff. So if I do this calculation, then ace-10, sorry, there's a typo. Ace-10 is definitely in the top 61.5% of hands I can have, so I need to call. Okay, so I'm not building a probability model for them. What I'm essentially saying is, if I'm not calling ace-10 here, then they can exploit me by bluffing too much, and I'm just folding all my hands here, and they're going to be able to make money off of me. To prevent this, I must call ace-10, which is a 61.5 percentile hand in my range, so that they can't exploit me. So I'm going to make an analogy with RPS. So rock, paper, scissors. Does everyone know how to play this game? So you either throw rock, scissors, or paper. So there's no ambiguity with this game, right? I know people, if you grew up in a different background, you might call it something else, or you might have different rules. But the rules I play with is rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and paper beats rock. Okay, so exploitative play, you think like this. You say, since my opponent just played rock 3 times in a row, I think they're probably not going to play rock a 4th time in a row. So I'm going to play scissors because I know I can't be beat. Optimal play just says I'm going to memorize a sequence of random bits and always play each of rock, paper, and scissors with probability of 3rd. So this is an analogy with rock, paper, scissors. And so one question I often get is, if when you play optimally, you're making all your opponent's decisions the same, then your opponent essentially is never making a mistake, because regardless of what they do, it's the same. Then how do you even make money playing optimally? So in rock, paper, scissors, that's true. If my strategy is just play rock, paper, scissors, each with probability of 3rd, I'm never going to beat you more often than I should. But in poker, there's enough opportunities to essentially be inconsistent. For example, like sometimes you'll see players fold 7-6 suited, and then because later they're like bored and feel like playing a worse hand, they'll like call 6-5 suited in the exact same situation, which is like basically making a strictly dominated strategy, or like check raising a strictly inferior range. Essentially, the theoretical optimal strategy will still extract money slowly from even the best players, because even the best players in poker right now, there's going to be slight inconsistencies that are not theoretically optimal. So essentially, okay, so the optimal strategy, another way to think about it is a Nash equilibrium, if you've heard of the term, because the best response to the optimal strategy is the optimal strategy itself, whereas the best response to any exploitative strategy is going to be a different strategy. Whenever you play an exploitative strategy, you stand to be beaten by a different exploitative strategy that re-exploits you. So this is the difference. Optimal play is you play each with the same probability. Optimal play, you're indifferent to your opponent's move. So optimal play, you're making a lot of money when your opponent does something strictly suboptimal, whereas in exploitative play, you make a lot of money when you're winning the mind games, and you lose a lot when you're losing them. So it's exploitative play is sort of like, I know that, you know that, I know that, you know that, I know this. But you know that, I know that, you know that, I know that, you know that, I know this. So basically, you get into these mind games, and if you're good at them, then it's pretty good, right? If you're playing rock, paper, scissors against a 4-year-old child, probably you don't want to play optimally. Probably you want to look at their face and try to figure out what they're going to do and try to beat them, right? But if you're playing rock, paper, scissors against the rock, paper, scissors world champion, which there is one actually, then probably you just want to memorize the sequence of random bits and play each with a probability of 3rd. So another good thing about exploitative play is it's intuitive. We sort of grow up thinking in terms of exploitative play, right? I think that's a fair statement. In most things, it's like, what do you think might happen? Okay, if that might happen, okay, I'll do this. But optimal play is sort of a weird mentality, because it's sort of like, I'm just going to analyze what my opponent could potentially do. So you need an opponent, essentially. And then I'm just going to perform an action that sort of makes it so that my opponent can't really beat me. Okay. So that's enough about those two general concepts. I'm going to take a short break right here since it's a good time. So I'm going to continue, and we'll get into some actual poker. But first, okay, we're going to play one last game. So, okay, we're going to play a game called Who's Taller, okay? Anyone can join the contest for $1. Okay, we're not actually having this, so don't get out your wallets. Okay, basically, okay, so, and then the tallest person who's joined the game gets the entire pot. So all the money, all the people who joined the game, we're going to measure who's the tallest, and then that person gets everyone's money. Okay, so let's play right now. So everyone close your eyes so that you can't look in here. Everyone close your eyes. No peeking. No peeking at how to... Okay, so I want everyone close your eyes. Is everyone's eyes closed? Okay, so put up your hand if you want to join the contest. Put it nice and high so that I can see. If you want to join the contest. Alright, so raise your hand highly. It's okay, there's no embarrassment. The whole point of poker is we're Okay, cool. So now everyone open your eyes. Okay, so I think 5 people joined. Okay, so okay, guys, come down here. Let's see who would have won. Let's see who would have won. Don't be shy if you joined. It's okay. It's totally okay if you lost. Okay, so I think the 4 of you. Okay, cool. Sorry, what's your name?
Justin.
Okay, Justin. Okay, so I think Justin would have won. So, all right, good job, Justin. You would have made $3 from this game. Okay. All right, cool. So, okay, what's the point of this game? The point of this game is, so from a game theoretic point of view, no one really should be playing this game. So this is only known as the K-Beauty game from game theory. So let's see. So how tall are you, Justin?
6'5".
6'5". Okay. So why did you play the game? Because you thought there's probably someone who's going to be like 6'2" who might play the game, right? So, right. But if everyone knew that, if you're only 6'2", you shouldn't be playing this game because someone might be 6'5", then you wouldn't play the game, right? Because someone else is only going to play the game if they were like 6'8" or something, right? So essentially, basically, so let's say we played this game again, probably only Justin would play. But eventually, this game always devolves to a situation where basically no one is willing to join. Because you know that no matter, even if you're like 7 feet tall, you're LeBron James, you would know that someone would only play this game if they were the tallest person in the world, essentially. So basically, poker without blinds, which is the money that's put into the pot at the start of every hand, would essentially be like the twos taller game. So when you play poker, you want the motivation of every hand to be stealing the blinds, stealing the money that was forced into the pot without the choice of the person. So you would always fold king-king, which is the second best hand in poker pre-flop, if there were no blinds. So suppose we were to play Who's Taller again, but I told you that I'm going to force Lee Marie to play. Okay? So now we've got a game. Because now, even if you're not sure whether you're the tallest person in the room, if you're taller than Lee Marie, then you have a chance of winning. So that's essentially why we need blinds to have a game. So basically, you want to think of... So you always want to think of how many chips you have in terms of the blinds. And so having $400 in front of you in a game where the blinds are $1, $2, for our purposes, is equivalent to having $4,000 in front of you in a game where the blinds are $10 and $20. Because essentially, everything you're wagering is relative to stealing the blinds that were forced into the game at the beginning. So in both of these situations, we say that you have 200 bets or 200 big blinds, or 200 BB. Okay, so that's how to calculate your stack size. But what's actually important isn't stack size, it's effective stack size. So effective stack size takes into account the stack sizes of the people remaining in the pot as well. So, okay, so I'll give an example. So in this case, we're the player with the ace-jack, and we decided to go all in. So what is our exact stack size? So the big blind is 2,000, the small blind is 1,000, and we wagered in total 42,000. So what's our stack size? 21, right? It's around 21. It's around 21 big blinds, but we didn't really risk 21 big blinds here, did we? Did someone? Okay, I'll give a $20 gift certificate. How much did we actually risk in some sense? Yeah.
I can't see quite well, but I think 12 and a half big blinds.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. Okay, I'll remember. I'll put it here. Okay, so we only risked 12 and a half big blinds because everyone in front of us has already folded, and the two players behind, the small blind and the big blind, one of them only has 7.5 big blinds, and the other one only has 12.5 big blinds. Can everyone see that? So even though UTG plus 2 has 32.5 big blinds, could have theoretically covered us, and we could have theoretically taken all our money. But on this hand, because they already folded, we're essentially only risking at most 12.5 big blinds. That's the most we can lose. So we can't be eliminated from the tournament this hand. So here's another example. So here you see this guy that I'm going to call Low Jack for now. You see him go all in for 16 big blinds. So in this case, technically, he could lose all his money because we have more than 16 big blinds, and we do cover him. But, you know, in reality, I'd say he's probably not, on average, risking 16 big blinds because most of the people who could call him, other than us, have way less than 16 big blinds. Does that make sense? So essentially, there's not like an exact formula for effective stack size, but you want to sort of think of it in terms of, you look at the stack sizes of all the people who could potentially play the hand against you, and you want to look at, you know, roughly how much am I going to be risking in this hand. Okay. Okay, so that's effective stack size. That makes sense to everyone? Okay. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about that's very important is position. So position is basically where you are at the table relative to the blinds. So how many players are remaining to compete versus me for the blinds? Essentially, the fewer players that are left, the less strong my hand needs to be to attack the blinds. So I'm going to give names for the positions. Basically, the thing that matters is how far you are from the button. So in this example with ace-jack, when everyone folded to you and you're the dealer, which is also known as the button, essentially to steal the blinds, you just need to get through the 2 blinds themselves. So that's essentially 2 players. And then, you know, if you were 1 position earlier, when it was folded to cutoff, then he had to deal with 3 players. So you want to name everything relative to the dealer, essentially. So we can just quickly go through the names. They'll get more familiar as time goes on. So the first person to act is, we call them under the gun. So that's this guy here. And then we go around the table. It's under the gun +1, under the gun +2. There can be different names for the same position. So in this specific hand, where there were only 6 players at the table, you know, you could have called low jack under the gun, because under the gun is the first person to act to the left of the big blind. But essentially, it's more clear to say low jack, because when you say under the gun, you have to say under the gun at a 6-handed table. And then people will know, okay, that means you got to get through 5 hands. But if you say low jack, it's very clear. You have to get through 5 hands. So under the gun, and then +2, and then low jack. You can also call under the gun +2, low jack -1 if you want. And then hijack, cutoff, button. Don't ask me where these names came from. I actually have no idea. Okay, and then small blind, big blind. So, okay, so that's position. And the importance of position is basically the later you are, the fewer hands you got to get through to steal the buttons, to steal the blinds if everyone has already folded. Okay, so the third thing is that matters in a poker hand is equity. So we talked about stack size, we talked about position. The last thing is actually your cards. So the equity of your cards is basically your secret height for the who's taller game. So you can think of it like that. Your cards is like your secret height. And the probability of you winning the pot, or equivalently the fraction of the pot you would win once the remaining cards are dealt, is called your equity. So okay, I'm going to give some examples of calculating equity. So here's an example where we get it all in on the turn. And so I have 5-4 of spades here. So I'm not in a great position, but let's try to count how many outs I have. So does someone want to just name a river card that would help me win the pot? Yes.
7 of spades.
Right, 7 of spades. So that gives me a straight and a flush, actually. Okay, so let's go along those lines. So how many spades are there left in the deck? Yeah.
Should be 9 spades.
Right, 9 spades. And then how many cards help me make a straight here?
6 more.
Right, a 7 or a 2, right. So it's 6 more because there's 8 7s and 2s, but I'm double counting the 7 of spades and the 2 of spades. So that's 9 plus 6, and then I actually have to subtract 1 more card. Does anyone see what it is? Yeah.
Queen of spades.
Right, the Queen of Spades, because that's actually a disastrous situation, because then if it wasn't all in, I would probably put in more money on the river thinking I have a flush and lose to a full house. Right, so it's 14 outs, 17 minus 3. Our equity is around 32%. It's 14 over the 44 cards that could still come. Okay, did that make sense to everyone? So that's one way of calculating equity. It's just a very simple probability distribution over the remaining cards in the deck that could come. And, you know, if you're worried, like, you know, what if someone folded the Queen of Spades, so I shouldn't be counting that? Essentially, you just want to pretend that the cards that are in the muck, like the cards that were folded by other players, they're essentially irrelevant because they could have folded the queen of spades, but they could have also folded an irrelevant card like the jack of hearts or something. So essentially, you just want to, all the cards that you haven't seen, it's easier to just assume that they don't affect anything. I mean, in theory, they affect things a bit, because, if you know that the dealer button folded 2 cards, even if you don't know what they are, they're probably more likely to be really crappy cards like 2s and 3s rather than aces, because if they had an ace, they would have played it. But I think not worrying about that is fine. You don't need to worry about it. Okay, another example of equity calculation. So it's the exact same example as before, but in this case, the probability distribution isn't over cards that could come. All the cards have already come. The probability distribution is just over my opponent's hand. So, this is the same calculation. We calculated our equity is 25%, and that's not a probability distribution over cards to come. That's a probability distribution over our beliefs of our opponent's hand. Okay, so example 3 of calculating equity. So this one you can't really do by hand. It's, so let's say you get it all in pre-flop with ace-king suited against pocket 2s. And you basically need a calculator. There's certain websites that help you do this. And ace-king suited against pocket 2s, if they don't have a 2 of your suit, is actually a very small favorite, which is kind of cool. But if they have the 2 of hearts, then you're actually a slight underdog. Okay. So just make sure for all the different things equity could mean. Equity could mean a probability over river cards, probability over the unknown. A very good calculator in general is Poker Stove, which I'll have lots of examples of in my slides, and you can download it via this link here. Right, so this is an example of using Poker Stove. So, you can put in exact calculations. Like, let's say you get it in with 2 of diamonds, 2 of spades, so pocket 2s on a flop of 5, 3, 2, versus a range where your opponent is going to have a big pair like pocket jacks plus. You can actually run it, and your equity is 85%, which is actually surprisingly low, I think. Because it seems like, you've got 3 of a kind. They've only got a pair. They have 2 chances to hit 1 of 2 cards, but there's a lot of random stuff that can happen. Like, if they have aces, they can make a straight. They can make a backdoor flush. The board could come 2 more 5s, which counterfeits their 3 of a kind deuces. So this is another example of calculating equity. Right, so this is just a summary of the different situations you might want to calculate equity. And yeah, I recommend you download Poker Stove, but you don't really have to. And I guess one question you could ask is, how do you actually do this at a table? So essentially, you just have to, if you do this a lot while you're studying about hands and thinking about poker, eventually I've been able to just memorize a lot of situations in general, what the probabilities are, or at least what the correct decision is. Okay, so now let's talk about raising to win the blinds and antes. Okay, so the antes, an ante is an extra small bet that each player must put into the pot each hand, and these sum to around a big blind. And they come in during the later stages of a tournament, and they're inexistent in cash games. So I sort of swept this under the rug in the earlier examples. So in, let me go back. So like in here, do you see the 1200 in the middle? So I actually sort of stuck this under the rug, but that comes from each player being forced to put in 200, which is 1/10 of the big blind, at the start of every hand. And if you're playing tournaments, then this will usually be the case. Antes will come in fairly soon. If you're playing cash games where you just sit down and you can leave whenever and you sit down and you just play for your own play money, then there's usually no antes. But antes actually make a world of difference in terms of what you want to do. So it's not just the stakes are bigger when there's antes, because you don't want to just think of it like there's extra money in the pot every hand. It's equivalent to the blinds being bigger. That's not true, because you also have to put in an ante. So if the blinds were proportionally bigger to cover the antes, you would have to raise to a bigger size to try to steal the blinds. But with antes, you don't need to raise to any bigger size to try to steal the blinds. So it's actually very action driving. It's very exciting. It makes it so that you want to play a very wide range of hands, and you really just want to be trying to win the blinds as often as possible, because winning one pot with the antes is so big. Okay, so this is what it looks like. All right, so the first thing I'm going to say is, if you're going to start playing tournaments tonight, is if no one has raised yet, you don't want to call. you want to raise to give yourself a chance of winning the blinds without seeing a flop. So I'd say the most common beginner mistake I see beginner poker players make is not raising when no one has raised before. So in this case, it would be just calling for 2,000 and trying to see a flop. But the main issue is you're giving the big blind, they can just check and see the flop for free. Whereas if you raise, you put them to a decision and they might fold and you might just win the pot for free without having to do anything, essentially. So how much do you raise? When I say raise, so the minimum raise size you can do is raising to 2 big blinds. However, this is a bit small because you give the blinds fairly good odds to make a profitable call, although it's not even that bad. So let me just talk a bit in general about raising big versus raising small. So the advantage of raising small is that you're risking less. Like, let's say you raise and then the next person re-raises and then the next person goes all in, right? So you know probably those 2 people have pretty good hands and you want to fold. If you raise to a small size, then you can fold and you don't lose that much. If I raise to like 5 big blinds, then I'm losing a lot more. But what's the benefit of raising big is you give other people worse odds to call. If I only raise to 2 big blinds, let's actually do this calculation. Let's say here, instead of going all in, I raise to 2 big blinds, which is 4,000, right? What odds am I essentially giving the big blind to call? So think about it as, so this is actually in this very exact situation, this is a very common mistake I see beginners make, which is you raise to only 4,000. Yeah.
So there's 8,000 in the pot and they have to call 2,000, so it's 41?
Right. So it's 41, but there's also the small blind. So there's actually going to be 9,000 essentially in the pot.
Is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's going to be 8,800. Yeah. It's going to be 8,800, so approximately 9,000, and they only have to call 2,000 to see the flop. Does that make sense to everyone? So their odds are actually 4.5 to 1. And you know, ace jack offsuit is a great hand, but there's no hand that ace jack offsuit is more than a 4.5 to 1 favorite against. So in some sense, you know, it's basically even if they have jack 2 or whatever, ace 2, think of the best possible case for you, you're still not doing better than the odds you're giving them. Okay, so on the other hand, though, you really don't want to. It is really risky to raise more than 2.25. So a reasonable rule of thumb, I'd say, is to raise to 2.25 big blinds in tournaments. I know it's pretty close to do. If you just raise to 2, it's probably not that bad. But roughly speaking, I think this is a reasonable rule of thumb. Earlier, you could try to raise to more. I think that's sort of customary, although I don't think it's theoretically optimal. You'll often see players raise to like 3 big blinds, especially when you watch like pro players, they'll raise to bigger. But the main reason is because they're the better player by a lot, and they're just trying to make big pots, which is reasonable. You know, if you think if you're trying to just play big pots and win big pots, then raising to a bigger size is fine. But I don't think there's any theoretical reason to raise to more than 2.25 big blinds in most situations. Other than when, like in cash games where all players have a lot of money, then it's a bit different, because also in cash games you're not worried about risking more because you're not worried about losing out of the tournament. But okay, so the other thing is, instead of raising, you should just go all in if the effective stack size is 12 big blinds or less. So recall, the rationale for raising big is to prevent others from calling for cheap, but the rationale for raising small is to lose less if we get re-raised and have to fold. But 12 big blinds is sort of the point where it's small enough that you never really want to fold after committing 2.25 big blinds. So if I only have 12 big blinds, I raise 2.25. I've only got 9.75 left after. You know, even if I get, okay, fine, if I get raised and re-raised, maybe I'll fold. But even if I get re-raised once, if I'm raising in the first place, you know, my hand is going to be reasonable. Like, if for the who's taller game, I'm not going to raise in the first place if I'm like 5 feet or something. So your hand will be reasonable. So this is sort of beginner mistake number 2, is being too scared to go all in pre-flop. So that's why this ace-jack hand, I actually cheated a bit. So technically here the effective stack size is, well, the big blind has 12.5 big blinds, but the small blind only has 7.5. So I roughly said the effective stack size is less than 12, and I just went all in. So that's definitely beginner mistake number 2 in tournaments, is to be too scared to go all in pre-flop. So what your goal essentially should be, I should say the rule is, so all of the numbers I said assume there's antes. If there's no antes, you should change it to 10 big blinds. So the threshold for going on should be less, because when there's no antes, you want to be risking less because the pot is smaller. Okay, so overall, when I talked about position, I talked about stack size. Essentially, what I'm trying to get the point across is, if you're just starting out, players tend to make all decisions based on their cards. It's just, I have a pair of jacks, I see my pair of jacks on this board, I have a pair that's pretty good, and you sort of tend to ignore what the effective stack size is, how much you're wagering, and position. But experienced players, the cards actually matter much, much less to them. In fact, if you're doing optimal play, you don't even care in some sense what your cards are, you just care what your range of cards are at that point. So experienced players, they're willing to raise the blinds with much weaker hands from good positions rather than early positions. And they're going to risk going on a lot more frequently with a lot worse hands if their stack size is low. So I want you to think about that. So if you're just starting out, that's fine. If you're still trying to figure out whether you have a straight and stuff like that, that's fine. And it's totally fine if you try to play based just on your cards. But I want everyone's goal by the end of the class to be able to play based on these other factors more so than your cards. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to give you some concrete suggestions for those of you who might want to start playing tonight of what hands you should be playing from each position. And so here, most of the tournaments will have 9 players per table, and so this is going to be roughly a range I recommend to open. So these are the range of hands you should be playing from the worst position, so under the gun at a 9-handed table. So there's 8 players left behind you who could pick up really good hands. So it's aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace-king suited, ace-king offsuit, tens, ace-queen suited, ace-queen off. Okay, so that's basically the list of hands. So this is these are only premium hands, right? This is like 6.2% of hands, I think. It's a very premium range. So note how tight this is. Okay, so yeah, because the thing to remember is only the best hand out of 9 hands at the table is going to get the pot. When there's 9 hands, even though the average hand is really bad, the best hand out of 9 hands is always going to be pretty good. So to even think that you have a chance, you need to start out with a very premium holding. Okay, so roughly what do you add as you go around the table? So for the second position, I'm going to post all these slides before the tournament start, by the way, so you don't need to feel you scramble to write all this down. I'm going to post it. So this is from the second position. I put in black the hands that I would open from the previous position, and I put in red the hands that I would open from that position in addition. So, second position, there's 1 less player. Okay, I'll gamble with 7s, ace, jack, king, queen, ace, 10 suited. So we'll get around the table, and then the range will slowly increase. Also note that these are very conservative ranges. If you watch high stakes poker, probably the players will open a lot more hands than what I'm recommending here. But my general experience has been, when you're just starting out to play poker, it's much easier to err on the side of being too tight than being too loose. So, because it's in some sense a lot easier to play pocket aces than 7-5 suited. With pocket aces, you're always going to have a pair of aces, or better, you just bet. And then with 7-5 suited, you need to be able to bluff very carefully. You need to sometimes be able to try to get value when you just hit a pair of 7s, and it's just a lot harder. So the ranges I'm suggesting are very tight by most poker standards. By tight, I mean conservative, but I think that's the right side to err on when you're just starting. So these are the range. Okay, so now we're going to as we get to the later positions, so this is low jack, we're opening more hands now. Any 2 suited broadways, so that's hands like jack 10 suited, queen 10 suited. It's basically any 2 cards that are the same suit and both 10 or higher. So maybe I should just run through this quickly. So why is having your cards be suited good?
You get the flush.
Right. So if it's suited, you're more likely to make a flush. But if you have 2 unsuited cards, then there's 2 different flushes you can make. Right? So, okay. Like if you have a queen of diamonds, 10 of spades, then you can make a diamond flush or a spade flush. But essentially that argument is wrong, because there's 2 reasons why it's wrong. One is it's not more likely, because you need 4 of the suit to make the flush. And 2 is when you make the flush, it's also more obvious you have the flush. Like if you only have one diamond, even if it's the ace of diamonds, once there's 4 diamonds on the board, it's way more likely that you have a flush, so you're going to get paid off less. Whereas if you have 2 diamonds in your hand and there's only 3 diamonds on the board, it's less susceptible that you have a flush. Okay, so hijack is 3 to the button. So this is what I would recommend. Okay, so any pair. So pairs are pretty good. Any suited ace. So suited ace means any card with any hand with an ace and another card of the same suit. Any suited connector. By that I mean hands like basically 2 cards that are next to each other and also the same suit, like 10, 9, 10 of spades, 9 of spades, or any 2 unsuited Broadway cards. So I do use a lot of terminology here, so yeah, please stop me if something is unclear. You can Google most of these, I think, but okay. So yeah, and suited connectors are good. So like a hand like 7-6 suited is often better than a hand like 10-6 suited, even though the 10 is bigger than the 6, because 10 is sort of a small enough card where it's not that relevant, the fact that it's a big card, but the fact that 7-6 is connected and can hit a lot more straights is very relevant. Okay, so for cutoff, I'm just going to show you on Poker Stove because there's sort of too many to list. But the thing I want you to note is the percentage. It's 30%, right? So remember, under the gun, I recommended playing 6%. So we've multiplied how bad our hand could be for us to play by 5. And I think this is what I really want you to try to do. And I think what a lot of new players don't do enough is they always play the same cards regardless of your position. And then even crazier, on the button, if everyone in front of you folds, I recommend playing about 55% of hands. This is huge. I want you to play Jack 3 suited. Who thinks Jack 3 suited is a good hand? Or King 4 offsuit, or Queen 6 offsuit. Okay. So now what hands do you play from the small blind if it's folded to you? So let's compare opening from the small blind to opening from the button. So for small blind, it's a bit different now. So I should mention this because when you're raising from the button, from the dealer, if you get called, you get to act last post-flop. So I'm going to talk more about this in future lectures, but this is basically called having position post-flop, and having position is basically good.
For all these hands, are you assuming that everyone's folded behind you?
Yes. If people haven't folded, essentially, I'll talk more about this in future classes, but essentially what you need to do if, let's say this guy raised and you're the button, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, you need to consider what his range is and calculate your equity against his range, which you can do.
Completely different.
Right. So the calculation is essentially completely different. So essentially, the first guy who raised sort of just determines sort of what the barrier to entry to the pot is. Because essentially, the first guy that raises is, if it's from under the gun, he's telling you my range is pocket 8s plus. Even if he's sort of loose, it's still going to be like pocket 4s plus and like, queen 10 suited plus. Basically, it's saying, if you're playing 8-6 suited, then you're basically an idiot because my range is way better than that. So essentially the first guy who plays this hand sort of sets the tone on how good your hand needs to be. Thanks for that question. Yeah. So I'll talk more about this in a future lecture, but essentially, essentially that's what you need to do. So from the small blind, let's compare opening the small blind from opening the button. So the issue with opening the small blind is if the big blind calls, you actually don't have position post-flop. The big blind gets to act after you post-flop. So it's actually a lot worse in some sense than opening from the button because you don't get to act last. But it is better in the sense that there's one fewer person you get through, and also you have less to wager, which is actually really relevant. Because from the button, if the blinds are 2,000 or 1,000, or okay, let's just take this. If the blinds are 20-40, if you want to steal the blinds from the button and you want to do 2.25, you need to put in 90, right? You need to raise to 90 and you need to wager 90. But if you're raising from the small blind, you only need to put in 70 more. So you're actually paying a smaller price to try to steal the blinds. But the fact that you're out of position is a very important negative. So I'd say all these factors balance out, and you can roughly play the same range of hands from the small blind as you would from the big blind. I think that's a reasonable rule of thumb. But the fact that you're out of position hurts a lot less as stacks get shallower, essentially as effective stack sizes get a lot smaller. So it's you could really drastically increase this range if you only have like 10 big blinds from the small blind. Okay. All right, so let me just give a few caveats about this. Okay, so actually, I'll leave it to you guys. Okay, if someone comes up with a very good complaint about these recommendations I'm giving you, I'll give out the last $20 gift card. Okay, so what are some problems, sort of? Okay, so normally I get lots of complaints in this section. You already got one, but you can answer. Yeah.
You're very predictable, so.
Right. Okay. Right, good. That's a very good point. So a lot of people ask me, why would you follow these? If I follow these, everyone knows what I'm doing. Well, the point is, for most of these, even this range, right, it sort of encompasses enough hands. So this is where I'm talking about optimal balanced play. I think, even though humans haven't solved poker, I think roughly, if you want to ask, I would guess that roughly the optimal range of hands to open from this position is something like this. It's going to be looser, but it's something roughly like this. Probably you want to probabilistically play some smaller cards just so when the flop comes 2-2-4, you can potentially have a 2. But essentially, you're not doing bad here, because if the flop comes 3 small cards, then you're going to be doing pretty well with all your big pairs. And if the flop comes big cards, you still got ace king, ace queen, ace jack in your range. So yeah, but that is a correct, that is a good complaint. And if you in theory, it's in theory optimal to play 7-7 some fraction of the time, 6-6 some fraction of the time, and like 2-2 some fraction of the time. But that's sort of making things really complicated. And if I don't want to add 2-2 to the list, because if you play 2-2 every single time, then that's way too loose. You're just spewing money by raising with 2-2 against this many players behind. But so ideally, maybe with 2-2, you should do a random number generator and 10% of the time play 2-2. That would probably be theoretically optimal. Okay, good. That would have gotten this, but okay, I'll give it to yeah.
I think another problem with playing really tight all the time is that you are also very easily bullied around the table. Right? So if someone bets and you really want to play, you really want to stick to your tight range, you'll fold and you'll maybe miss out on something that you shouldn't have depending on your position and things.
Right.
Like
okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. So these are pretty tight in that. It does give other people incentive to raise a lot because everyone's going to be folding a lot because they're just waiting for these really good hands. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's good. So, okay. Are there any other questions about these suggestions I gave you guys, or other potential complaints? I'm going to give this gift certificate to you unless someone thinks they have another complaint. Okay. Okay. So I'll give this to you at the end. Okay, so, all right, so this is one thing that I didn't really address. So I talked about going all in as well as just raising. So how do these ranges differ? The answer essentially is they don't really differ. So, let's say, here these are the hands I told you to play, right? Let's say you're sort of small enough, you only have 12 big blinds with antes, and you're supposed to go all in instead of raise. Which of these hands do you go all in with? It's roughly the same range. So yeah, I think as a decent rule of thumb, if you just go all in with the same range, you're not going to be doing badly. But when the effective stack size is much smaller, like let's say you only have 3 big blinds, then you can drastically increase this range. Okay, so when your effective stack size is actually, say, 10, or let's say your effective stack size is 5 big blinds, intuitively you might think, I can wager a lot wider a range of hands. So here's the argument. The argument is, I'm only risking 5 big blinds. In the other case, I was risking 12 big blinds. Why should I should be way more aggressive with 5 big blinds than 12 big blinds, right? So that's the argument. But the reason why that argument is wrong is because with 5 big blinds, you're going to get called every time. With 5 big blinds, you can't just go all in with 7-2 offsuit because your opponent has such good odds to call, they're going to call you. Whereas with 12 big blinds, even though you're risking more, you also have more chances of getting everyone to fold. So even though it seems like you're risking way more, in some sense you're not. Because the more chips you're risking, the more likely it is that everyone else folds. Does that argument make sense to everyone? So make sure you don't get tricked by that, because it is easy to get tricked. But the fact that when you're risking more, you're getting people to fold more, means you're actually not risking as much as you think you are, and that's like a common fallacy. Okay, cool. So, so we're near the last part of the class. So, are there any other questions? So, I know some of you probably want to start playing tonight, and I definitely did not address everything you need, but. Are there any other questions, roughly, in terms of opening and going all in, that you might want to know before, like, playing tonight? Because I do think we have maybe 5 extra minutes, so I can answer some questions. Does anyone not know what the term, like, bluff means? I said bluff a bunch of times, but I realized I never explained. So bluffing essentially means you have a bad hand, and because you have such a bad hand, you know the only way of winning that hand is to get your opponent to fold. So basically, you bet big to hope that your opponent folds. If you have a better hand, like an average hand, often you actually don't want to be betting, because there's no point. Because when you bet, you're essentially just getting adversely selected, where your opponent calls you when their hand is better, and you lose more money to a better hand, and your opponent folds when their hand is worse, so you're not making any money from a worse hand. And then with your best hands, you want to bet to try to get your opponent to call and increase the amount that you win, and we call this value betting. So I'm going to get more into this in future lectures, but essentially in poker, the paradigm you want to play is you want to value bet your very best hands, and then you want to basically check and try to get you showdown, like try to show your hand on the river with your medium hands, and then also bet with your bad hands to try to get your opponent to fold better hands. Okay, I'm going to get to the last part now. Okay, so quick tests. Okay, so here, what would you do? It's folded to you, you're in the hijack, you have ace-5 of clubs. So someone want to suggest, what would you do? What would your play be?
Call.
Raise. Okay, good. Raise. So not call. That was mistake number 1 to not do. You always want to raise the blinds if it's folded. But it's fine. It's fine. That's fine. We're all here to learn about these hands. Okay. Now, should I go all in, or should I just raise to 450, which is 2.25? I should go all in. So, okay, I think it's not terrible to just raise to 450, but I said if it's 10 big blinds, there's no antes, right? So you need 10 or less, and you have 10, so going all in I think is fine. Okay, so we decide to go all in. And yeah, so roughly this is what, so there are Nash calculators. They're complicated, but if you run this through a Nash Equilibrium calculator, this is roughly what you should be going all in with. Okay, so we go all in. So this range is a bit different than what I showed you before, because this is an actual Nash calculation, not just my recommendation. It's going to be wider than what you saw before, but that's fine. Okay, so now you're this guy. You're seat 9. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do a quick calculation of what equity you need to call here, and I'm going to so what equity you need to call here. So a straight up pot odds calculation says you're getting 23 to 20, or 1.15 to 1. So you roughly need 46.5% equity to call as this player. But there's 2 players behind. There's a graphics glitch. Seat 1 has not folded. Seat 1 and Seat 2 both has cards. So you actually need more than 46.5% equity, because the calculation of 46.5% assumes Seat 1 and Seat 2 can't wake up with pocket aces. So, PokerStove is very good for this, and you can do this right now. I've taught you everything you need to do these calculations. And PokerStove is also easy to figure out how to use. You can essentially just plug in, you look at pocket 5s, it has 48%, you need 46.5%, and I said you need a bit more than 46.5 due to the fact that there's 2 players behind. So pocket 5s, it's good enough. Okay, well, I'll call. Ace-9 suited, I'll call. So I'm just showing you some calculations on PokerStoves. It really is a really good tool. So you can do some calculations, and so basically, they call. And the hands I showed you here is actually sort of the worst hands that it's plus EV to call with. Pocket 5s, Ace-9 suited, plus, so Ace-9 suited plus means Ace-9 suited, Ace-10 suited, Ace-Jack suited, all the hands that are strictly better than Ace-9 suited. Ace-10 offsuit, King-Queen suited. Okay, so now, as the last player here, do you call with King-Queen suited? It's just a rough guess. How many of you intuitively would call with King-Queen suited? So 2 players have already gone all in. So most people would fold. Oh, you guys would call. Okay, so it turns out, at least according to the Nash calculator, which is not... So here you calculate the pot odds, and this is an exact calculation because there's no more players behind. So you just calculate, do I have 29.5% equity? And basically, if I assume that player 1 and player 2 are playing according to Nash Equilibrium or optimal ranges, you actually have way more than enough. You actually have 34%, where you only needed 25%. So this was sort of a trick question I set up. The trick was, King Queen suited doesn't seem like a good hand, but against 2 other hands, it's actually relatively a very good hand. You know, against one other hand, they could just have a pair and you're behind. They could have an ace most of the time and you're behind. But against 2 other hands, you actually have really good equity. Because when you hit a king or a queen, you have the big pair. You can also hit straights and flushes with king, queen suited. And your equity against 2 other hands is very good. Okay, so you have way more than enough, so they call. Okay, so we're going to get in this all in pre-flop. Okay, so who are the people I gave these cards to? So you guys can come up to the front, and I'm going to hand you your cards. The people who I gave these gift certificates to, who I said.
Yeah.
Do you want me to stay up here?
Yeah, stay up here, stay up here. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is, okay, so these are the hands people went all in with. Okay, so who was the first person to answer? Okay, so you get to pick. Which hand do you want?
Yeah. I'll go with Jack Jack.
Okay, so Colin. Colin is going to take Jack Jack. Okay, sorry, what's her name?
Kevin.
Kevin. Kevin, which hand do you want? So he took Jack Jack. Which of these remaining? You were second, right? Yeah, you were. Okay. Okay. Which hand do you want?
I want King Queen.
Okay, so he's going to take King Queen suited. So you're going to take Ace 5 of clubs. Okay, so this is okay. This is sort of mean, but this is. I want to show you guys. This is how poker works. When you've already won, you've won $20. So you guys are gonna put your money in, and whoever wins this hand is gonna get all 60. Because the poker, the winner takes it. So okay, so this we're gonna go forward.
Predetermined.
Okay, so this is the pre-flop equities. Yeah, so it is predetermined. Okay, so it looks like you guys did very well. You guys picked correctly. You got to pick first. You picked the best hand with equity of 34.73. You got 33.95. You're only a bit behind with 31.1. All right. Okay, so the flop is 6, 7, 8. So let's look at the probabilities now. Jacks is still ahead. Ace 5 has picked up a lot of outs. King Queen of diamonds is not looking too good, but they did pick up 1 diamond. Okay. Darn. Turn is the 9 of hearts. So I'm sorry. Wait, you guys King Queen? I'm sorry. So you're the running, and then
he needs a 10.
Okay. Do people want to cheer? Is there any card you're hoping for? What are you hoping for?
Yeah,
10 or a heart.
Oh.
Okay, so you want to be screaming. Okay, I'm going to press it on the count of 3. Okay. You want to be screaming 10 or heart. And you want to be screaming not anything else. 10 of spades. Okay, so I guess you get all 3 of this. But there's going to be more of these gift cards during class. So participate in class. You're going to get gift certificates courtesy of the Cubic Campus. All right, thank you guys.